Hi students, we're going to begin the lecture material for this week with the election of 1960, which pitted Richard Nixon for the Republicans against John F. Kennedy for the Democrats. This is an election that Kennedy is going to win quite easily, but it shows the way society and politics is changing during the 1960s. Big part of the reason that Kennedy wins is because of his successful performance in the first presidential TV debates. And so Kennedy is famous for his charisma. He's famous for his charisma, his careful cultivation of his public image. And his father is the one who is very good at public relations, who explains to his son that it's more important how he presents himself, how he's perceived, than his actual policies in many ways. And so we see the rise of more of a celebrity approach to the presidency that you definitely don't see with Eisenhower, Truman, even with FDR to a certain extent. So this is the rise of the popular president that we see for the first time with John F. Kennedy winning the 1960 election. Kennedy came in with his own program to continue the New Deal, which he referred to as the New Frontier. New funds for education, new medical insurance for the aged parts of the population. But many of these measures were blocked by Congress, blocked by conservative Southern Democrats, blocked by Republicans who were opposed to these policies. Congress nevertheless approved some more progressive measures, an increase to the minimum wage, new funding for housing, and what's called the Alliance of Progress. Basically, this was an equivalent of the Marshall Plan, but designed for Latin America. So this is a funding that goes to Latin American countries to try and prevent the spread of communism or to support alternatives to communism. Otherwise, Kennedy's main domestic achievement was persuading Congress to devote large amounts of money to what was becoming known as the space race. Up until Kennedy's presidency, the Russians had been ahead in efforts to send the first satellite into space, Sputnik, in 1957, and send the first human being into space in 1961. And this is considered important in the context of the Cold War for a couple of reasons. Firstly, it suggests that the Americans are falling behind. Remember that the Cold War is a competition of ideas, or a conflict of ideas. The success that the Russians are enjoying in this final frontier, trying to reach outer space, suggests that perhaps communism is more effective in stimulating technological achievement than capitalism or liberal democracy. And so it's important for the United States to be seen to be competing, to be seen to be winning for that respect. It's also seen as important from a military perspective. And that is that Americans become concerned that the Russians will use their control of outer space to fire missiles that can attack the continental United States. And so it's for these reasons that Kennedy successfully encourages Congress to devote money to the space race, which in the end, we know that the United States will win in 1969 when they are the first to land on the moon. In other aspects of the Cold War, Kennedy's presidency is focused around the island of Cuba that had fallen under the power of a communist dictatorship led by Fidel Castro in the late 1950s. Castro overthrows a previous dictatorship, establishes a worse one, rival political parties are banned, political opponents are imprisoned, public executions take place, and the presence of a communist state so close to the United States, only about 90 miles away from the coast of Florida, this is really worrying for the United States. And Kennedy promises as part of his campaign to be tougher on communist Cuba than Eisenhower had been. And so early on in his presidency, he launches what becomes known as the Bay of Pigs invasion. This was intended to be an invasion led by anti-Castro Cuban exiles. Would land in Cuba, they would receive popular support, they would overthrow Castro, they would receive American military support when necessary. However, Castro knew that the invasion was coming, and he knew where it was coming. And so the invasion itself becomes a fiasco. Once the Cubans start to struggle, Kennedy loses his nerve, pulls out of giving the Cuban exiles military support, and many of them, if not all of them, are either killed or captured. And so this is a great humiliation for Kennedy, but it seems to have been an experience that he learns from. Cold War remains focused on Cuba in 1962 when the Soviet Union attempts to put pressure on the United States by establishing nuclear missiles in Cuba. And these were missiles that could have reached any of the major cities in the United States with the exception of Seattle. Seattle was the one city that was too far away, but otherwise, suddenly the whole of the United States is at risk from these missiles. And the Soviets are starting to pour more and more missiles into Cuba. And so this is a moment of intense crisis. Are the United States going to go into Cuba with military force to remove these missiles? Are they going to be able to move fast enough? Is that going to lead to an all-out nuclear war? And we know that the Kennedy administration evaluated how many Americans could die in the event of a nuclear war. And so it's a moment of extreme tension, which Kennedy and the Russian Premier Khrushchev are able to overcome. Khrushchev knows that the Soviet military is still outgunned by the American military. And so he agrees to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for the US, promising openly never to invade Cuba again, to leave this communist dictatorship in place, so close to the coast of Florida, and a secret agreement that the United States will remove its own nuclear missiles from Turkey, where they were targeting Russian cities. And so, in a sense, it's a public relations win for both sides. What we see in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it comes to be known, is that both sides realize how close they had come to a disastrous, destructive nuclear war. And so it's from this point onwards, in the second half of Kennedy's presidency, that we start to see efforts made to de-escalate the Cold War conflict, and even to start destroying or reducing the amount of nuclear weapons that each nuclear country held. Most of that will not be overseen by Kennedy, however, because he is assassinated by a communist in Dallas, and this opens the way, or this leads to the Lyndon B. Johnson administration.